I have been waiting to reach this episode again. I'm so glad that the time has come when I got to rewatch and, of course, talk about what is Cliff Clavin. This is the Jeopardy episode of Cheers. This is episode 14 from season 8. It's directed by Andy Ackerman. And as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts. It's a fabulous episode. There is one aspect where I feel like there's a bit of an oversight. And by oversight, I mean, if my way of looking at it is correct, then it would have changed the entire course of the future of Cheers. I'm also willing to admit that I'm overthinking it, and there are excuses they could make to work around the oversight, but I'll talk about that when we get there. The episode starts off with somebody coming into the bar, and he remarks that he hasn't been there in more than 20 years, since the 60s. Just for information, the Bull and Finch actually opened in 1969, which is a little interesting. And this person's remarking on how everything has changed, and he says they even changed the panelling. And Woody asks, where? And the guy asks, over there behind Norm, which I love. Obviously, it's implying that Norm has been there for at least 20 years. It was a nice, fun way to start things off. We then have two parts of the narrative, and the first one to be introduced is quite a fun mystery. Sam gets a phone call from somebody called Carmen, and she wants to know why Sam stood her up. Sam has no recollection of making this date. And then we find out that his little black book is missing. So Sam turns off the lights and says, whoever took it, put it back. It doesn't go according to plan. Nobody puts it back. Cliff then comes in, establishing the second and main part of the narrative. Jeopardy is in town, and Cliff is going to take the test to apply to be on the show. And then Sam heads out to the laundromat to find his black book, because that's where he remembered seeing it last. Cut to sometime later, Cliff comes in, absolutely overjoyed. He's going to be on Jeopardy. And I will say now that first of all, being in the UK, I never really saw Jeopardy on TV, but I have over the years seen clips online and things, so I'm aware of the show, I'm aware of the concept, but certainly if I were a big Jeopardy fan, my opinion of this might be different. I might find things to be funnier, but to be honest, there wasn't anything in it that wasn't funny, so I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But the point there is that if I had a bigger relationship with Jeopardy, maybe it would have been a different experience. I'd certainly love to know how you find the episode if you are a big Jeopardy fan. There are also a couple of Jeopardy goofs on IMDb, on this episode IMDb page. The goofs don't really mean anything to me, but if you're interested, that's worth checking out. It just makes it a little bit more fun. Rebecca then suggests that maybe Cliff could tell a funny Cheers anecdote to give the bar some publicity, and then they start talking about the bad keg of beer and glow-in-the-dark fungus and a dead possum. Not necessarily the stories Rebecca had in mind. Sam then comes back in, couldn't find his book, and then somebody called Annie calls, and apparently he'd also made a date with her and stood her up, which he hadn't. And they realise that whoever's got this book might just be working their way through the book, and there could just be a load of girls at this rink, which is where apparently all of these dates are being set up. And suddenly everybody realises there could just be a load of barely dressed girls at this rink, and half the bar gets up and leaves, which is awkward, but it's funny. We then cut to back in the bar sometime later. Frasier, Woody and Norm are talking about maybe going down to Jeopardy to be in the audience to cheer Cliff on, and Frasier said that he can't because he told Lilith he'd clean the dog's ears. Did they have a dog? Frasier definitely isn't a dog person, as we learn in the TV show Frasier, but I feel like I could be completely blanking, but did they have a dog? Am I forgetting something? I might well be. Sam then comes back in. More girls have called, and it's a really good mystery. Who could be doing this? Why? What's their motivation? I think it's a really fun part of the narrative, and they don't give away too much. And then we have something that happens that, as I said, on the one hand feels like a huge oversight that could have changed the entire course of the show, but on the other, there are arguments for how they could get around this. And this is the fact that they realise that this person is going through the book alphabetically by surname, and they're up to the G's. The H's are next. I'll come back to that in a moment because it brings, obviously, Rebecca Howe into the story. And I realised what letter comes before H? C. Whose surname begins with C? Diane Chambers. And I realised, well, Diane is in the book. This was confirmed at least in the episode The Book of Samuel, where where she reads out a great big compliment about herself, and it turns out that Sam knew she'd read it. So she's definitely in the book, and that means that this person would have phoned her, and that would have been the first time Sam had contacted Diane in a very long time, and it absolutely could have changed the entire course of the show. Now, the excuse they could use is that even if she's still in the book, I don't remember if Sam removed her from the book, but if I'm forgetting that, please tell me. If we know he removed her, it completely makes this a cow's opinion. Everything I'm saying is actually incorrect. But assuming she's still in the book, they could argue that, well, it would be her Boston number, so she wouldn't be at that number anymore. However, I would argue that there is no way Diane wouldn't give Sam her new contact information. Because you don't go from almost getting married one day to not bothering to give that person your new contact information within a couple of days. Maybe one could argue Sam didn't write the details down, but at the same time, I feel like that's maybe just not the most believable. So for me, and this is purely what I would do, this is my opinion, my perspective, obviously I'm not Sam, but I feel like it's almost definite Diane would have at least given Sam her new number. Maybe after that she'd forget to contact him, but within a couple of days after getting married, or almost getting married, you would give that person your number. And I feel like Sam would write it down, because his little black book is his everything, and he wants it to be as complete as possible. Maybe Sam wouldn't write it down, maybe it would be too emotional. But for me, that's how I view the situation. So I feel like this person would have phoned Diane. I feel like she would have given Sam her number. Maybe by this point the number's changed. Who knows? But either way, I feel like it was a huge oversight. And I feel like the most realistic outcome is that she would have the same number. I don't expect that she would have the money to just be bouncing around apartments and constantly moving. And that Sam would have at least written that number down within the first few days. Maybe he wouldn't have done, but that's how I see the situation. So I consider it to be an oversight. But again, if I am forgetting something that makes this completely pointless, then obviously let me know. But it just occurred to me that doing the whole A to Z thing makes it a little bit awkward, because Diane's in the book, this person would have phoned the number, and I believe that Sam would have had a more recent contact for her within a couple of days of her moving away. Again, after that, yeah, I can see it reasonable that she would forget to contact him and Sam would be too overcome with emotions to contact her. Who knows? But either way, I just thought that was quite interesting. And had this person contacted her and reached her, it could have changed the entire course of the show. Not that Shelley Long would have come back, but either way, I feel like it's just a really interesting point that I've probably spent far too much time on. Back to the episode. So Rebecca doesn't want to play along, she doesn't want to be involved in this, but then Carla says that if she doesn't, she'll bring up a very personal thing about Rebecca that she happens to know about. So Rebecca agrees. Turns out Carla didn't know anything, which I thought was kind of obvious anyway, but it's nice to have that confirmed. And we then cut to Jeopardy. And we have the host, Alex Trebek, and Norm and Woody are in the audience, which I thought was really nice. That didn't need to be the case. It would have worked just as well, but it was nice to occasionally cut to them and to hear their thoughts. I thought was a really, really nice touch. And the first group of categories are civil servants, stamps from around the world, mothers and sons, beer, bar trivia, and celibacy. If Cliff didn't do well, there'd be something very, very wrong with this. And we cut to sometime later, and Cliff has $22,000 in the bank. The other contestants have $33,750. He's done very, very well. And for the last question, the clue is Archibald Leach, Bernard Schwartz, and Lucille Lesueur. And the category is movies. And the other contestants don't do very well. They get the wrong answer. So Trebek says to Cliff, even if you're wrong, as long as you didn't do anything foolish like wager everything, you're a cinch winner. And I think by emphasising that as long as Cliff didn't do anything foolish, it became very clear that Cliff had done something foolish. And his answer is, who are 3 people who have never been in my kitchen? Which, to be fair, is correct. It's not the answer they were looking for, but it is a correct answer. And it turns out the answers actually were the real names of Cary Grant, Tony Curtis, and Joan Crawford, which is an interesting bit of trivia to learn about. And yeah, it turns out Cliff did wager everything and he lost. So that sucked for Cliff. We then cut back to Cheers. Norm asks for a beer. Rebecca said that she doesn't see any money. So Norm says that maybe he should go to the cash machine, but maybe on his way there he would let slip the thing he knows about Rebecca that Carla told him, and Rebecca gives him a free beer. Of course, he doesn't know anything either. And the fake Sam then calls. As predicted, he's asking for Rebecca. He's now reached the H's, and Rebecca plays along and asks this person if he'd ever heard of a bar called Cheers, which was a bold move because that's assuming that the person who took the book doesn't know that it's Sam's book and that they just found it lying around. Whereas up until that point, it would seem like, in my opinion, that the book was taken by somebody who knows Sam and they were maybe playing a trick on Sam. But by saying, have you heard of Cheers? It suggests that they think it's somebody who's never heard of Sam because, as we know, Sam has a habit of flaunting Cheers and using it to his advantage. Certainly more so when he owned the bar, but I still feel like it's something that works in his favour. Alcohol on tap, of course, which will appeal to a lot of the young girls he's trying to go to bed with. And by asking, have you heard of Cheers? That could have really thrown a spanner in the works because if they knew it was Sam, then of course they would have heard of Cheers. But thankfully it worked out well. And this person agrees to come to Cheers, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Cliff then comes in feeling rather sorry for himself. We get some comedy surrounding that. And then it's time for the fake Sam Malone to walk into the bar. And it's just a young kid, just a teenager. And Sam asks him, are you Sam Malone? And we find out quite quickly that yes, this was the person pretending to be Sam. And he said he did it because, and I quote, I've always wanted to be a Sam Malone, which very clearly was music to Sam's ears, because that's basically praising Sam. However, that quickly turns around when it turns out that this kid hadn't actually heard of the name Sam Malone, didn't know he was a baseball player, and he just wanted to be a quote-unquote babe hound. And Sam tells him that you can't just be a babe hound, you have to start off as a babe pup, which I thought was quite adorable. The kid leaves. Sam feels really good about the advice he gave him, and Rebecca remarks that he's a regular Father Flanagan. Coincidentally, I actually last week watched the film Boys Town from 1938 with Spencer Tracy and Mickey Rooney. Spencer Tracy plays Father Flanagan, so just as an aside, decent film, definitely one that's worth watching. And then Alex Trebek actually comes into the bar. Carla, as one might have expected, flirts with him. And then Trebek actually apologises to Cliff and says that a case could actually be made for Cliff's perspective, as they'd phrased the question in a way where there was more than one possible answer. Not that they can do anything about it really in the moment. Cliff hadn't won. It is what it is. But it's fair to say Cliff had a valid point. And Trebek says that because of this, he's going to quit his job as host. And Cliff comforts him, and Trebek finally says, okay, I won't quit my job. And now Cliff is actually happy because he feels like he saved Jeopardy, which was a really nice thing for Trebek to do. It could have backfired because it could have really played with Cliff's emotions, because Cliff could have then thought, well, I lost Jeopardy and now I caused Trebek to quit. But thankfully it didn't work out like that. Turns out Trebek only came in for a beer and happened to see Cliff there. But I think it was ultimately a nice thing that Trebek did. And we end the episode there. It is a solid episode. As I said at the beginning, I was very excited to finally reach this one, because even though I don't have an emotional connection with Jeopardy, I've never seen a full episode, put it that way. I've seen clips, of course. It's still a tremendously fun episode. Cliff was just fabulous, and the mystery with Sam I thought played out wonderfully, aside from the fact that in my opinion Sam would have an up-to-date number for Diane, because at the very least, the way I would see it playing out, and this is purely my opinion, one could argue that actually it didn't happen this way. Maybe Sam took off the very next day, but I feel like Sam would have stayed around Cheers for a little bit. Diane would have phoned at her destination. She would have phoned the bar. Sam would have taken the call. He would have grabbed his little black book from under the bar and written down her new number, not really giving it much of a thought. And that would have been their last communication. I don't want to think that the last words he said to her at that point were have a nice life and she never phoned him again. I just don't believe that even Diane, who is very selfish and wrapped up in her own bubble, would go from day one almost marrying Sam to day 2 or 3 or however long it took for her to get there, would then not think to call him with her new contact information. But one could argue that she didn't. One could argue Sam didn't write down the number in his book. But again, I feel like Sam spent so much time making this book complete that I feel like he would have grabbed his book from the bar, written it down, maybe without thinking, and then that would be the last he heard from her at that point. But again, there are arguments for that not playing out that way, but in my mind, they could have completely avoided this potential, this theory, by not going through things A to Z. And they could have just assumed that at some point, this person would have called Rebecca. They could have argued that maybe everybody had a star rating. Rebecca only had 1 star, as we learned from this episode. Maybe this person was going through the higher stars first. I imagine there wouldn't be any stars next to Diane's name. I imagine maybe Sam would have scribbled out the stars, kept her number, erased the stars. So there are workarounds, and I am willing to admit that I overthink it, but Cheers is my happy place. It is my favourite thing ever. So I do like to dig deep into the weeds and identify things like this. Because in theory, the fake Sam phoned Diane, she answered the call, realised maybe it wasn't Sam, but it started her thinking about Sam. She comes back to Boston and they get married and everything's glorious. That was never going to happen. But it's nice to think about. Either way, that aside, whether or not there's a valid argument for Diane's name not being in the book, I feel like it's a delightful episode. As I said, I was really looking forward to reaching this one again. What is Cliff Clavin is an absolute joy. And I'm jumping back in here at the end as I thought of another excuse as to why my theory wouldn't work. Presumably, if Diane did give Sam her new number, then there would be the area code, and the fake Sam would realise it wasn't a local number. So they might not have bothered calling the number. But at the same time, I feel like this kid would have given it a risk. He would have challenged it because, who knows, maybe this person would be so keen to meet Sam they would fly in. So maybe you could also argue he didn't bother phoning because it clearly wasn't a number local to Boston. But at the same time, given the kid and the fact that he just seemed eager to see all of these women, I feel like he would have given it a chance anyway. And I'll sum up again by saying, what is Cliff Clavin? It's an absolutely fabulous episode.